We are heading toward the precipice. The EU seem relentless in their pursuit of war with Russia, to such a degree that the USA has been labelled as an enemy of the West. Why? Because their president is intent on making a deal that would assure peace in the 21st century. Donald Trump has floated the idea of withdrawing American funding and military support in the ongoing war between Ukraine and Russia, and has since done so. This is untasted waters for the EU, since America, at least since World War I, has been old reliable, with the EU using American might to overthrow regimes who are antithetical to Anglo-American hegemony, and America using the EU to clamp down on independent European nations. This has been the dominant programme for America and Europe for over a century, first in theory and following World War II in practice. Now this old order appears to be getting dismantled. What will come of it is yet to be known, as all futures must be fought for, otherwise they will be decided for you. So where is Ireland in all of this? Interestingly, it has come to the surface over the last few days that Ireland could be saddled with a massive fine by the EU. Why? For missing carbon emissions deadlines. So where do we stand? Ireland, according to the Climate Change Advisory Council and the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council, are currently standing at an excess in carbon emissions stemming from transport, buildings and agriculture. Add to that land and forestry emissions, given current estimates doubling their allocated ceiling. Ireland, if failing to meet the 2030 targets, would have to buy carbon credits from other European nations who had overperformed. However, with many other nations also faltering in their reaching of these carbon emission targets, Ireland could be left with no other option other than to buy or pay EU fines, which could fall anywhere from between 8 billion and 26 billion, and for a country the size of Ireland, whose gross national income, which is the amount of money created here that stays here, is at about 300 billion at the generous end. These fines could range from being about 2.9% to closer to 10% of the Irish income. That would be an economic disaster if it was imposed on Ireland by the EU. This figure forecasts even darker skies when we are to look at the impact it would have on government expenditure. In 2023, this was about 105 billion euros. And so if we offer government expenditure for 2030 to be about 120 billion euros, could be more, it could be less, then these 8 to 29 billion euro fines by the EU could mean that between 6% and 25% of the funds for government expenditure could be wiped out. Losing a quarter of annual spending isn't abstract. It's immediate cuts or debt. Those are the options. The 2023 surplus was 8.3 billion euros. This fine dwarfs it, flipping Ireland into a 20 billion euro deficit overnight. Public debt at 223 billion in 2023 would balloon towards 90 to 100% of gross national income. So we would make about the same as we are in debt. We would be level, right? There would be no extra money for anything. These levels were last seen post-2008 bailout. This is a looming catastrophe, which can only be sidestepped by an even more radical approach to trimming industry in this country to comply with carbon targets imposed by the EU. We hear a lot from Irish politicians about, quote, moral and legal international obligations, end quote, most notably in reference to immigration. However, Ireland are locked into the framework of the Paris Agreement, and the enforcement of EU law are what give this Paris Agreement force. We will remember that Donald Trump withdrew America from this agreement. Ireland are not in that position, as they are locked into EU law and bound to the actions imposed on them from the EU, with Ireland's debt and their membership in the IMF limiting any wiggle room Ireland has. Irish governments have cemented Ireland totally under the thumb of the EU. And Ireland, just at the very same time that von der Leyen, who's the president of the European Commission, has called for the rearming of Europe, have now begun the process. The rhetoric has been sparing but persistent over the years of deconstructing the triple lock. The policy mechanism known as the triple lock governs the deployment of the Irish Defence Forces, particularly their peacekeeping missions. This triple lock is a three-step safeguard which is grounded in Irish commitment to neutrality and sovereignty, While this process limits any, quote, impulsive sending of troops, it effectively takes Ireland's autonomy away. So what have the Irish government's position been on the triple lock? For context, let us look at some of Micheál Martin's statements regarding this. In April of 2013, Martin offered the following, quote, "It appears that Fine Gael is arguing that Ireland is failing in its European responsibilities and is allowing Russia and China to have a veto over our peacekeeping activities. This is nothing more than an out-of-touch ideological obsession on the part of Fine Gael, which ignores the facts of Ireland's international standing." End quote. In December of the same year, Martin said the following, quote, "Earlier this year, the Minister for Defence signalled that he would try to water down Ireland's commitment to the triple lock, which is at the core of our neutrality. He presented the idea that it was contradictory and that we were giving unsavoury countries a veto over our actions. This argument has been behind the efforts of a wing of Fine Gael to erode neutrality over the years, and I and my party completely reject this." End quote. He added again, quote, "The current policy works and it has complete popular legitimacy. There is no reason whatsoever to change it." End quote. Of course, Martin or his defenders will make the claim that, sure, that was over 10 years ago and times change. That is true when speaking about issues such as allowing an old tree to slowly die when it is in close proximity to your house. When the tree is young and small, there is no issue. However, as the tree grows and covers your home in shadow, then the circumstances have changed, and so a shift in perspective will be seen as following reason and not as betraying some hypocrisy. The difference in this situation is the fact that we are speaking about fundamental existential principles. So, should a nation be able to decide of its own accord what it does with their defence forces, or not? This question deals with autonomy, self-determination, and freedom to choose, immovable principles, where one's change of position has drastic implications and, quite naturally, call into question that person's total political philosophy. For indeed, Martin's tune has changed, as evidenced in his words of 2023. From the 21st of April of that year, he said, quote, "Personally, I think there is something morally wrong with the fact that an authoritarian and aggressive neo-imperialist power has a de facto veto on elements of how we as an independent republic react to any given situation." End quote. He added, quote, "With the experience of recent years, can we genuinely and honestly say that the triple lock remains fit for purpose?" End quote. And again in November of 2023, he said, quote, "It makes sense to amend existing legislation to allow us to respond to crisis situations with more agility, and where in making these important decisions we are not surrendering our sovereignty." End quote. And another, he added, quote, "There is no proposal and there will be no legislative proposal to come before this House to undermine our policy of military neutrality. We have made that crystal clear. We are not members of a military alliance. There is no proposal to join NATO." End quote. In 2025, just this month, Martin said the following, quote, "It has absolutely nothing to do with military neutrality, as is asserted time and time again in this House. Nothing." End quote. And again, quote, "This is about exercising our own sovereignty. The idea that any permanent member of the UN Security Council can have a veto, including Vladimir Putin, on where our defences go is not democratic." End quote. It's important to recognise that the triple lock itself hasn't changed in form from 2013 to 2025. The same conditions and principles have been at play. And so one must attempt to account for Martin's 180-degree pivot, where he went from viewing the triple lock as, quote, "at the core of our neutrality," end quote, to seeing it as having, quote, "absolutely nothing to do with military neutrality, as is asserted time and again in this House. Nothing." End quote. Martin has been just as fleet-footed in his juggling of concepts such as neutrality. In 2013, he asserted, quote, "Instead of sniping at our neutrality, the government should acknowledge what we have achieved because of it and strengthen rather than undermine it." End quote. It's interesting to note that the previous statement was made while he was in the position of opposition in government. We can compare this with his more recent statement as Taoiseach in 2023. Quote, Equally, these questions must not be reduced to a simplistic binary choice, staying as we are today or immediately seeking to join a military alliance such as NATO are not the only options. There's a more nuanced, informed, and layered discussion to be had unpacking and examining our long-standing policy of military neutrality. End quote. Here we see Martin suggest that one would need to be a sophisticated thinker, such as he clearly thinks of himself to be, in order to be able to entertain the idea of changing the triple lock or of re-evaluating Ireland's neutrality. On sovereignty, Martin said in 2023, quote, "It makes sense to amend existing legislation, where in making these important decisions we are not surrendering our sovereignty," end quote. To go on and say, quote, "This is about exercising our own sovereignty. The idea that any permanent member of the UN Security Council can have a veto is not democratic," end quote. It's important to hold Martin to his words here as he champions the importance of self-determination, sovereignty, and the will of the people, i.e. democracy. So, let us assume that the triple lock is to be scrapped. Where does this leave the decision-making capacity regarding the deployment of Irish soldiers? With the potential for a UN veto out of the way, any deployment of Irish soldiers would fall squarely, first on the government and second on the approval of the Dáil. This would leave the decision to enter into any conflict, peacekeeping or not, for it must be remembered that there's no legal foundation to Ireland's military neutrality, and so with the triple lock out of the way, your sons and daughters' lives will be in the hands of Micheál Martin to turn over to any EU war if he so wishes. And so we would do well to remember his words. Quote, "Let there be no doubt about where Ireland stands. We want nothing to do with a backward-looking idea of sovereignty. We remain absolutely committed to the ideals of the European Union," end quote. And so, with war looming between the EU and Russia, there is every opportunity, should this triple lock be scrapped, which it looks like it will be, that Micheál Martin will choose to send Irish soldiers to fight in an EU war. The next choice is yours.